Welcome to the Great Language Partner podcast. I'm Katja.
And I'm Nicole. We are two neurodiversity affirming speech therapists on a mission to bring joy to your autistic child's communication journey.
Separately, we've helped hundreds of neurodivergent kids become confident communicators, but we know we can make an even bigger impact together. Whether you're a parent or professional, we're here for you as you navigate your unique journey.
We'll talk all things gestalt language development, sensory processing, and beyond as we share practical tips and inspiring stories to help you become your child or student's greatest language partner.
Let's create a more understanding, supportive, and affirming world for autistic kids.
One conversation at a time.
Hey everybody, it's Katja here, and I have Amy Zembriski joining me. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Katja. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, me too. I'm excited to chat about neurodiversity affirming goals with you today and what that means and get some ideas from you.
Yeah, awesome. I'm excited. This is like something that I absolutely love to share with families and with professionals. So I'm excited.
Awesome. And yeah, you're really amazing at it and have so many amazing ideas around this topic. I have your Neurodiversity Affirming Goals resource, and it is loaded with goals, and I shared it with my team and they have been loving it. What inspired you to create that?
Well, if I'm honest, my frustration out of being so burnt out after writing my evals really brought that on, because I'm sure SLPs know just like how much love and time it takes to really write a really well thought out report, especially for our neurodivergent clients. So by the time that I would get to the end of it, I just like didn't even want to think about my goal writing. And so I ended up putting this resource together for that reason. But then the second reason is really because I felt like I just had so many SLPs reaching out asking me, like, how do I make my speech therapy goals more neurodiversity affirming for my autistic clients? And not only how, but like, how do I write it, right? Because I think that's where a lot of people get stuck. And that's me personally too, right? I can understand a theory behind something, but if I'm not given some kind of like concrete example, it's still difficult for me to sort of grasp. So that's kind of how that resource came to play. I mean, I know there's a lot of goals in there. I think I have like 125 goals, but it's still not perfect. And I'm still like always making something new, but sort of referencing that as a framework for my clients.
Yeah. I mean, it's a goal bank of neurodiversity affirming, gestalt language goals. All of that is something that was on my to-do list. And I'm glad you did it before me, so I didn't have to put in the work, because it's exactly what I would have created and more. But yeah, I think it's helpful to have the measurability of the goals, because that's a hard piece when it comes to trying to be child-led. We have this general idea, but how do we measure it? How do we write it in a way that's going to be approved by schools or insurance? So that's helpful. But I want to talk about what makes a goal neurodiversity affirming. I know generally neurodiversity is kind of the movement that is pushing to accept that neurodiverse brains that are different, and these differences are welcome and beautiful, and that's kind of the basis of neurodiversity. What's in your opinion, what is a neurodiversity affirming goal?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that I think about when I think about what makes a goal neurodiversity affirming. And one of the first things that I really think about that makes a goal neurodiversity affirming is whether or not that goal is really relevant and meaningful to the child, and that the goal that I'm writing, or maybe the goal that I'm reading from somebody else, is really supporting the child and tapping into their strengths versus trying to change something that doesn't really need to be changed. So that is the very first thing that comes to mind of, am I making this goal that's really helpful, or is it really just because we don't because we want them to appear more neurotypical, right?
Yes.
Um, and I think that's a really, really big thing. And I think what else is really challenging for other people is identifying what situations are like more neurotypical expectations versus how maybe their autistic client may want to do things, and like what's quote unquote appropriate and what's not, right? So um that's something that I really take into consideration. And then the other two things that I always want to add into my neurodiversity affirming goals is that the child or the individual can use several modes of communication, right? We know that autistic individuals, but even neurotypical individuals, right, they use a multimodal communication approach, right? And even if we take out autism, right, neurotypical people use their phones, right? They text, they email, they use gestures. But I think that's something that I'm glad is gaining more awareness, that people realize and they're acknowledging that our children don't have to use verbal speech every time they're trying to communicate with us. So having that total communication approach inside of my goals is something that I really like to add. And then the third thing I always really try to consider are what accommodations or supports do they need so that they can actually be successful in achieving the goal. Because we can write 20 goals for a child, but if we're not writing them in a way that is going to identify the supports that they need, they're never going to be able to achieve it. And even just something as simple as setting a realistic timeline, right? I don't know what setting our listeners are in, but I'm in a private practice setting. So I'm with insurance. And so I've started to now have to shift how long like my time frame is for some goals, especially for example, for our gestalt language processors, where maybe they're not using our language right away. So instead of having a time frame of like 3 months, maybe I've changed it to like 6 months or 8 months, whatever it is. So like making things that are really achievable and realistic for the kids.
Yeah, thank you for that. I love your comment about including multimodal communication and also including accommodations. When I get a goal from another therapist, those are the two big green flags. If I see that written right in the goal, child will use multimodal communication. It gives them the opportunity to meet that goal in whatever way is best for them, whether it's speech or AAC. And then also seeing accommodations written right into the goal is such a green flag, and something that it was a more recent shift for me. Like, oh, I can write that right into the goal so it's not missed. If we're thinking about IEPs, it doesn't have to go only in the separate accommodation section. It could be right there. And an example of that for people listening would be an accommodation might be that the child will have access to sensory supports. So in the goal, we would write, use with access to unlimited sensory supports, such as fidgets, a wobble chair, whatever, insert whatever they're needing, then they will achieve this goal. And it's such a great way to make sure that these kids are getting the support that they need to be successful with whatever we're targeting. And I love that you mentioned that. And also the piece about the goal being something that's truly beneficial to the child. When I started discovering the neurodiversity movement and child-led therapy and shifting away from behavioral therapy, because I was very much in that camp for a while. A big question that I would ask myself whenever I wrote a new goal or was reading another goal by someone else was, is this benefiting the child, or is this just making the people around the child feel more comfortable? And
Right.
just that question alone, I feel like can go a long way.
Yeah. And that's such a good point that you mentioned, because like when I started working with the pediatric population, my experience working with autistic kids honestly was like very minimal, like almost none. And so when I started, I did, all the things that I would never do now. but definitely made a lot of goals based on like behavior. Or I think my biggest thing is that I noticed I made so many goals just based on verbal communication, right? And that's something that I still see a lot of. And I think it's so important to just really continuing to spread the word that some of our kids just don't have that ability to consistently access the verbal speech. And we need to give them a way to communicate that's accessible to them. And that's really what I tell my families, I had someone call me and say, if you're not going to teach my son how to talk, what are you going to do? And I shared, I'm going to empower him and I'm going to teach him how to communicate with you in a way that he can access. And if verbal speech is not something he can do right now, it doesn't mean we're never going to do it, but we have to like take a step back and see what can he do. And then we're going to sort of build off from that. So I love that you say that about like, is this goal making your life easier or is it really beneficial to the child?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and that discussion of prioritizing speech over whatever means of communication for the child is most tangible, is one that I think all of us face, and something that a lot of autistic and something that a lot of parents of autistic kids probably really have to grapple with as well, because every parent wants their child to speak and every parent wants to hear their child's voice. So I think many parents of non or minimally speaking kids have had to make the shift, or are maybe in the process of making the shift of accepting that, other forms of communication are just as valid and wonderful. But it's not always an easy one.
Yeah. And, I just became a mom recently, as you know, like in November of last year. And so I have really been able to put myself in the shoes of my parents now and just being able to, and I think that's made me a better clinician, honestly, because
Very, yeah.
I'm sure that there's this like just having to process that maybe my child isn't using their verbal speech. What can I do? Am I doing something wrong? Like there are so many things that I'm sure these parents are working through. And so it's just really helpful for me to understand that their perspective. And so like meeting them where they're at too, when we're creating these kinds of goals and knowing, we're not going to be working on verbal speech, but, let's help your child decrease their frustration in the meantime. And let's see what can happen when we maybe expose them to AAC. I mean, I've had some wonderful stories where I actually just had a mom message me yesterday saying, my daughter no longer uses her AAC because she's progressed so much, right? And so you don't know how like it's going to impact your kiddo, but we do know that research shows that access to that alternative means to communicate can only help their language development.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I get those stories as well, or just stories from parents who have finally accepted AAC as a valid option and then seeing their kid flourish with using that as well. And it can be truly life changing. And I've seen so many kids be able to share their thoughts. I have a student who we introduced to AAC just a few months ago, and he's picked it up so fast. And just a couple of weeks ago, family shared that now he's making jokes on it. He will intentionally, say like silly insult to mom or something along those lines, and everyone's cracking up. And it's so cool to be able to see his personality come through. But yeah, AAC, we love AAC. Let's chat about some other goals that are not so neurodiversity affirming and maybe some alternatives. One that I see come up a lot is like eye contact goals, or more typical joint attention that we're often taught as parents, is something that is a precursor to language. And we know with autistic kids, that's not necessarily the case. They really show joint attention in different ways. But I've gotten a lot of great ideas from your goal resource on some alternative joint attention goals.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a big one. And, you know, knock on wood for myself, I haven't gotten too many like outside evals with that goal as much anymore. So I'm really excited about that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about anybody else, but at least for me, which has been really nice. But yeah, instead of, having this goal for eye contact, we also have to think about what are other ways that autistic individuals can show that they are establishing that joint attention, right? And I think the one thing that people can miss because it can sort of be like quote unquote behavioral, right? I tell people, if your child is protesting or they're angry at what you're doing, like that is joint attention because they do not want to do what you're doing. And in their own way, they're self advocating for themselves or they're protesting, right? So that's like a big one. And I feel like an obvious one that people tend to miss because I think we get so focused on trying to de-escalate like the behavior that we don't count that as joint attention. So that might be something that we can measure, right? Or if a child takes a toy from my hand, even if they're not looking at me, that means that they obviously are aware of their surroundings. If a child is really intently watching me, but they're like I have some kids, and I'm sure you do too, Katja, where they'll watch me, but they're like nervous to play because they want to be perfect at it. And so they'll just like really intently watch all the steps that I take before they even try. So that in and of itself, I think is joint attention, even if they're not making eye contact, right?
Yeah, and it's often like watching out of the side of their eye or,
Yeah.
you know, not always obvious that they are paying attention to you playing,
Mhm.
modeling AAC, but then so many of my kids will, pick up what I modeled even when I didn't think they were looking at all.
Mhm.
That paying attention can look very different for neurodiverse
Yeah.
kids who are always on the move or not seemingly, sitting and looking intently.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually was doing a standardized assessment with one of my kiddos. Don't love them, but I take insurance, so we do them just for that. And it was interesting because we were doing the test and he was just like walking around freely throughout the room. And I just kept reading the directions and I was like asking him to point to a picture and he would like come all the way from the opposite side of the room and come back to the picture and point to like the item. And so it was really cool to see that he was listening to everything I was saying. He wasn't having like a terrible time, even though I don't like to do those, but he was totally fine and content just like walking around the room and then coming back to the testing booklet once I like finished the prompt. So that was a really cool like moment that I got to experience with him because he really was paying attention to everything that I said. And for other people who may not realize that movement is really helpful, they might see that as, oh, he can't sit down, he's not paying attention. What is he doing? And so I think we have to really presume competence in that too.
Totally. I'm constantly telling parents to not uh, give up or feel like discouraged if their child is not showing typical joint attention. For example, with book reading, so many of my parents that I support tell me, "Oh, my child, doesn't enjoy reading books," and I'm like, do it anyways. Read to them, even if you think they're not um, fully participating. If they're walking around or playing with something else, they're still getting the benefit of you reading to them. And they're probably checking it out and taking it in more than you think they are. But it can be a difficult shift to acknowledge that this joint attention can look so different.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for people who are listening and are like, well, how would you write a goal?
Yeah.
So I'm not going to read all of these, but I did have my book handy because I had a long day and there's no way that I would have been able to remember.
Yeah.
But but for example, I might write a goal about how a child might shift their body like really subtly, right? Like sort of what Katya was saying. Maybe they like turn their head ever so slightly and they like they're watching out of the corner of their eye, or maybe they do turn their whole body towards you, but they're still not like looking at you, but they are acknowledging that you're in that direction. And so for something like that, I may write, the child will respond in their preferred way. And then in parentheses, shift in body positioning, vocalization, etc., when called by name by their communication partner to shift attention to an action or object during a highly preferred activity 3 times spontaneously, like within 6 months or something. So I feel like that's a really nice goal because that's another goal that I hear like, or I see written that the child's going to respond to their name, but it's almost like they're just doing it randomly. Like if you're eating and I'm like, Katya, and I'm expecting you to look at me, it's just not meaningful. But I'll embed something like that within an activity that they enjoy. And like, will they respond to their name if I'm playing with something that I know they love? And I say, oh, hey, Katya, look, I have this really cool car that I know you're going to love. And so that goal just like encompasses 2 things that I really like for joint attention. And also because when I talk to families too, right, they have very like understandable and realistic expectations that they want from their child, like being able to respond to their name is like a safety thing too, right? So we do want to target that on some level, but this is a really nice way to target it naturally. Or maybe we are identifying their joint attention through shared enjoyment, right? The child will display signs of shared enjoyment. And then in parentheses, you can describe what that means, smiling, laughter, showing or sharing items in a response to a communication partner's actions during a preferred activity, 3 times spontaneously within 6 months, right? So we're just defining what that shared enjoyment could look like in the goal so that other people also know what to look for versus like stare at me and have direct eye contact for 30 seconds, which I'm sure is very uncomfortable for neurotypical people too.
Totally. And yes, that shared enjoyment goal is one of my favorites. And it's one of my favorite just general goals to start with a kid that I'm supporting on their language development journey. Because everything starts there. Everything starts with that shared
Yeah.
connection. And if they're not getting joy from whatever they're experiencing with you, then they're probably not going to pick up all that much that you're trying to model for them. So starting with that joy uh, is big, but especially when it comes to that joint attention idea, it can be a really affirming place to start.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And like you can't get anywhere with a kiddo if they don't trust you and if they don't feel safe with you at the like at the bare minimum, that's what they have to feel for them to really want to engage with you at all. So I think that's great. I didn't even think about like using that goal as like a precursor almost, but yeah,
Yeah,
you're so right.
yeah, because we often see these kind of not so neurodiversity affirming or just precursors that really don't take autism into mind, these things that we might expect to neurotypical kids to engage in, like eye contact and such prior to speech. But I find that most of those precursors don't even apply to these kids. But yeah, but every child, we should really be starting with that joy and that connection. So
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I agree with you. And actually, I had a mom ask me to look over her son's IEP because she felt that she just wasn't 100% in agreement with the goals that they had set. And so I told her that I would be happy to look at them. And it was the play goals that they had established, like, I guess, after the evaluation. And her son does not have a diagnosis, but she is suspecting that he may be on the spectrum. And so she just shared, I don't know if these goals are really appropriate because I don't feel like they're going to impact him academically. And so I took a peek at the goals. I can't remember the exact verbiage, but generally, what their concern was is that during free play, her son is not able to really like I guess engage in pretend play, and so he sort of will wander around the room until someone will like I guess give him direction on what to do or guide him to an activity.
mhm.
And also he's interested in his peers, he'll observe them, but he doesn't really like prefer to socialize with others during his play, right? And
And
so that's
that
go
is
ahead.
super typical.
Yeah, yes.
Most of the kids that I support.
Yeah, exactly. And so And I told mom, I'm not going to be here to tell somebody how to do their job, but I always sort of bring it back to the parents. Like, what are your goals for your child? And do you feel like these goals are meaningful for them? Or I gave her different alternatives, right? So wanting to, like, instead of having to sort of quote unquote worry about having to bring her son to an activity to like have him engage in pretend play, can we make a goal where he's going to be able to entertain himself with a preferred activity for a certain amount of time? Because he loves books, he loves numbers, he loves letters. Like, I know if I let him play with certain toys in my office, he'll just do that the whole time, and that's okay. And so that was an option that I gave to mom. I also said maybe we can create a goal for self advocacy where he can communicate to the adults of, ooh, I don't actually wanna play with people right now, and I prefer to play by myself, or I prefer to play with these objects that are, like, my preferred item. So, it was a very interesting conversation with mom because when I had explained it to her, she was like, "Yeah, this makes so much more sense. Like, I'm not worried about these other goals because I don't feel like they're going to academically impact him." And I totally agreed.
Yeah, play goals are definitely one that I see a lot coming from schools and more from teachers than SLPs. But yeah, they're definitely one that I find are very, very rarely neurodiversity affirming because yeah, it goes back to, is it actually supporting the child, or is it just what we think they should be doing to be happy or uh, engage with other peers? But so many of these kids really don't desire that peer engagement, at least not in the way that we are e- expecting them to. They might really be happy just observing from afar and really being by themselves. And it doesn't really benefit them to force that. Um, and yeah, when it comes to play goals in general, I find my kids who have clearly had play goals, maybe an ABA or otherwise, someone has taught them how to interact with specific toys or activities. It's not play. Play is, intrinsically motivated and truly joyful and truly fun for the child. If they're playing with this dollhouse in the scripted way that their therapist taught them to, it's not truly play because they're probably not really enjoying it. They're just doing what they've been taught. Um, so yeah, overall, play goals are not my favorite, and your alternative of giving them self advocacy goals is usually what I'm suggesting as well. Yeah, but also that play comes with their language development, and I think that's to understand and also help parents to know that if your child is a gestalt language processor, for example, as they move from echolalia to self-generated language, we usually see that play really develop. Kids who are using echolalia, they're probably not doing a whole lot of pretend play that's, spontaneous. They're probably acting out scenes, maybe, favorite shows, probably doing more solitary stuff. And then you see that pretend play often develop more as a child had self-generated grammar in those later stages. So some of that play that you might really love to see might come later, but we also have to think, is this play goal um, appropriate developmentally, and where their language and other developmental stuff is falling. Yeah, so many things to,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, and it's so true. And I'm just thinking about how you said, when it's like very obvious when we see that a child has been so heavily prompted and shown how to play. There are some kiddos that I work with who are older. I mean, when I say older, like 12, 13, but they'll come to me and they're just the sweetest. And usually parents or like an old provider will say, they're very easygoing, they'll do whatever you want. And sometimes, or if not most times, I find that it's like that over prompting and over teaching of um like play often I feel like is them almost losing the sense of autonomy. And so it looks like they'll do anything, but maybe they don't even know anymore that they have a choice and they have that ability to like decide what they want to do, right? And so for those kids, I end up really trying to write goals that are going to help them develop like independence or or that self agency, right? That idea that I'm a person who can decide things. And it's very interesting. I'm working through that right now with a client, but she has such an extensive history of just so much prompting of having to be told what to do. Otherwise, she'll just sort of wait until someone gives her something. And so I do have to give her some levels of support. So right now, mom has been lovely and has been adding a lot of like preferred activities into her AAC. We've been doing a lot of training on that. And, you know, even though I know we shouldn't ask as many questions, we're at least trying to teach her daughter, can you show us the activity that you would like to do today versus I'm telling you what we're doing? So I think that's such an important thing that you share because I do feel like some of these kids really just lose that like sense of self or just self agency and knowing that they can make these independent choices.
Yeah, and you're talking about that in regards to play, but I'm sure you see it
Mhm.
all the
Yeah.
time in regards to language as well, and the two often go hand in hand. Kids who have had a history of more behavioral interventions with play and their way of being also are typically pretty prompt dependent with language. And yeah, it's the same thing, really teaching them that language can be joyful and can be for more than just requesting and is more than just what people have taught you is expected to say. I feel like so many of my kids that have been told what to say for years, that's what they see communication as. And much more than that. They haven't been given a chance to see communication as anything else. And it's such a hard thing to break down. And yeah, as you mentioned, it comes down a lot to just silence and not prompting and taking away all of that prompting, and over time giving them the space and trust to be able to give their own language or play or um, whatever else. But yeah, that's a big one, and that's a big thing to consider when we're writing goals as well. Is all of that. We really don't want to build prompt dependency with these kids, and that can be a hard thing to avoid if we're not careful.
Yeah. And I think one of the biggest things that I noticed too, because, as I was trying to write a goal, um, one of the things that I included in my goals for like the self agency is also providing enough wait time, right? Because, and I'm guilty of like having done this before and I know better. So I do better. So I don't do this anymore. But sometimes I tell families, we should give them at least maybe even up to a minute before we try to intervene, before we try to ask them, what do you want? Tell me. And we really have to give them that time because some kids really, and most kids actually that I work with need that extra processing time, right? They don't, they need more than like 3 seconds to respond to whatever it is that I'm sharing with them. So
Yeah, and that processing time is totally something that we could write into a goal as well. I am often writing in my language goals that child will spontaneously and independently produce whatever target. That way, I'm avoiding anyone in the future thinking that the target should be prompted or, directly imitated or read off of a sentence strip or whatever it may be. I'm always typically emphasizing that it should be totally spontaneous and independent and, truly what the child is naturally wanting to say in the moment versus what we're hoping they will say. I could talk about that for a long time. Are there any other goals or that you'd want to touch on, ones that you think you've shifted?
I think in my practices in general that I've shifted altogether is just not making goals that are easy for me, because I also think that's where like that was a trap that I fell into, right? And I totally can empathize with every single SLP out there just feeling so overwhelmed, and like we're so inundated with paperwork, and sometimes truly like it was just easier for me to write, the client will produce 10 nouns with max verbal cues by this time. And so I've 100% like shifted from that. And so I really want to honor all modes of communication. I want to make sure they have access to sensory supports. And I want to make sure that the goal is meaningful. So I think just like the overarching idea of like just not making goals that are not neurodiversity affirming, like that's just a practice that I've shifted altogether. And I try my best to really think about like different areas that we can touch on that um, I guess neurotypical people might expect from them, but then identifying what goals would be more appropriate, if that makes sense. Right.
Yep. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you for all your insight. I'm going to link your neurodiversity affirming goal bank in the episode. Is there anything else you want to plug or mention? If not, you can share where everyone can find you. And we'll link that as well.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so excited. Thank you guys for having me on here. I love you guys. And I'm excited to just like get this out to more people. If anybody wants to connect, I am on Instagram at amyz.theslp. And you can find my neurodiversity affirming goal writing resource there. And I have a couple of things also for implementation for AAC and GLPs that I'm working on. So I look forward to connecting with everybody.
Awesome. Yeah, Nicole couldn't be with us today because she had a migraine. So she'll probably want to have you back maybe to talk about AAC and GLP. So maybe we'll chat again. But thank you so much for your time, Amy.
All right. Thank you.
I love